Hey, as we're talking about our series, Living Beyond Myself, one of the great challenges of just even saying something like this is that when you're being selfish, it's really even hard to notice that you are being selfish. It's hard to even figure that out. In fact, there was a New York Times article that had this title, and it was said this: "I'm okay, but you're selfish." And it was based on research that came out of the field of psychology, where they said that 60% of people reported that others are overly concerned with themselves. And yet when they turned this question and asked them about them, only 17% of people felt that this applied to them. So in other words, everyone else is selfish, but I'm okay. And this is one of the problems with selfishness, is that it actually distorts reality, that you lose your ability to be able to see others, to be able to see God in the way that God has designed things to be, the way that things actually really are. And so because we are, as a society, becoming more untethered from God as a significant reality and part of our lives, what we're discovering is that we are in the age of relentless self-promotion. That we are constantly presenting ourselves, explaining ourselves, selling ourselves, defending ourselves. And so Os Guinness goes as far as to say that this is the most narcissistic age that we have ever discovered. And he puts this as his conclusion: in the era of the self and the selfie, the world is full of people, full of themselves. In such an age, I post, therefore I am. What I'm hoping that you'll be discovering as we go through this series is that the only antidote to living beyond myself is the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that you and I have the opportunity, with God's grace, to be able to discover a far better way of living than that of constant self-promotion and looking down on other people. And so today we've been talking about the variety of ways that we overcome kind of this selfishness in our lives. And so we've looked at these different areas: overcoming emptiness. We looked at the life of King Solomon. Last week we looked at overcoming paralysis and how the Israelites were kind of stuck in their own patterns and habits and being fixated on themselves. And today we're talking about overcoming doubt. But the doubt that we're talking about today, I want to be very clear, is not the kind of doubt of skepticism and atheism. The kind of doubtfulness that comes from the story that we're about to read is not geared towards outside the church. It is actually doubt that is an arrow being pointed right at the heart of God's own family and God's own people. And so the doubt, as soon as I say that word, you might be instantly thinking, well, I'm a believer, so this sermon doesn't apply to me. Actually, this sermon directly applies to you and to me, especially if you're in the church. And so turn with me, if you will, to a fantastic chapter in the Old Testament. We're going to look at Judges chapter 6. And we're going to look at a significant portion of this chapter today. I know you're going to want to be able to see it with your own eyes and be able to see some of the incredible jewels that God gives to us inside this passage. This is a story of the life of Gideon, and Gideon is known as one of the great heroes of the Bible. But I think you'll agree with me by the time we get to the end of this that Gideon is not a hero in the classic kind of way. That if this is the way that Bible lifts up heroes, then we're really missing what the overall message of Scripture is actually trying to teach every single one of us. So we're going to be looking at Judges chapter 6, starting in the first verse. The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and for 7 years he gave them into the hands of the Midianites. Because the power of Midian was so oppressive, the Israelites prepared shelters for themselves in mountain clefts, caves, and strongholds. And whenever the Israelites planted their crops, the Midianites, the Amalekites, and other eastern peoples invaded the country. They camped on the land and ruined the crops all the way to Gaza and did not spare a living thing for Israel, neither sheep, nor cattle, nor donkeys. They came up with their livestock and their tents like swarms of locusts. It was impossible to count them or their camels. They invaded the land to ravage it. Midian so impoverished the Israelites that they cried out to the Lord for help. In other words, things got so bad, they finally cried out to God. And when the Israelites cried out to the Lord because of Midian, he sent them a prophet who said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I brought you up out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. I rescued you from the hand of the Egyptians, and I delivered you from the hand of all your oppressors. I drove them out before you and gave you their land. I said to you, I am the Lord your God. Do not worship the gods of the Amorites in whose land you live, but you have not listened to me." At this point in history, God has charged his people with not only the salvation and the giving of the law, but they are to inherit and to inhabit the promised land that God has prepared for them. But in doing this, they have become afraid, they have become timid, and they have started to worship other gods. And so they have become commingling with these other cultures and these other religions, such to the point that they've lost their identity and they've lost their way and they've lost their God. That is what's happened to the people of God in this land. And what we find out is that what's about to happen in this passage is the most visionary thing that maybe you've ever seen in the Bible. The angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak in Ophrah that belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, easy for me to say, where his son Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites. And when the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Look at the text. Where is Gideon in this moment? It's not a trick question. It's on the screen. He's in a wine press. This is what a wine press looked like in the ancient world. It was a place that was hidden so that you could contain all of the work that you would do with the grapes. If you're old enough to remember it, do you remember the I Love Lucy episode where she rolled up her legs and began to kind of press on the grapes? Threshing was something usually that happened out in the open, so that the wind could grab it and pull away the extraneous parts of it. Gideon is hiding away at this point. He's not obeying God's commands. His people are living in fear, in isolation, in chaos. And the Lord approaches Gideon and says, "Hail, mighty warrior." You're about to see one of the most remarkable transformations in the Bible. That Gideon goes from being a complete coward to being a mighty warrior. The Lord is the greatest visionary in all of history, for he does not see Gideon for who he currently is. He sees Gideon for who he is to be in relationship to him. And so what I want you to hear right at the outset, right now, is that when God looks at you, he does not look at you right now for who you are. He looks at you through Christ for who you will be because of his sacrifice and his righteousness. And so you might ask, as we go through this text, what is it going to be like for Gideon? How is he going to possibly come from a coward into a mighty warrior? Well, I'm glad you asked. There are 4 stages of doubt that Gideon goes through in order to be able to make this journey. And the first stage that he goes through is that of ignoring God. Both he and his people ignore God. Did you notice the verse when we stopped here and it said, "But you have not listened to me"? Neither Gideon nor God's people have paid attention to God's commands or the way and the promises that they were called to live. And is there any other command that probably applies to Mother's Day better than this one? How many of you listened to your mother all of the time and always did what she said? And how many of you would have a better life if you listened to your mother and what she said at the time? Kelly and I were reflecting upon some early childhood moments recently, and we stumbled across this moment that we both love. It was a moment when our youngest daughter, Ashby, she was doing something in the kitchen. We can't even remember what exactly that she was doing, but she had like a piece of candy or a toy that she wasn't supposed to, there was something that she wasn't supposed to have that she had in her hand. And so she had that item in her hand, and when Kelly said to her, Ashby all of a sudden did this and started walking to try to find her way outside the room. And we're looking at her, and Kelly goes, Ashby, what are you doing? And she didn't say anything, and she kept walking with her eyes closed, trying to walk out of the room, trying to feel for not running into anything. For some reason, in this stage of development, Ashby believed that as long as she didn't see her mother, that her mother couldn't see her. And I think that's a normal stage of development for human beings, and I think it's actually a normal stage of spiritual development for us. We're really not that much more sophisticated. I don't see God right now, so God doesn't see me. And that's the way that we kind of tend to operate. It's almost a functional atheism. We don't realize that the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. This is one of the refrains that happens over and over again in this story, that they did what was right in their own eyes, or they did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They weren't realizing that God was this constant presence who was always with them, that they were actually ignoring God. And so here's what I want you to know when it comes to ignoring God: that the Lord is with you even when you ignore him. God is with you even when you're not paying attention to him. It says, "Hail, mighty warrior, the Lord is with you." God wasn't on Gideon's radar anywhere. Sure, he was a part of God's family. Sure, he was a part of the covenant promise. Sure, he was a believer in whatever kind of sense. If you'd walked up to Gideon and say, "Do you believe in God?" he would have probably said yes, but God wasn't anywhere on his screen. And yet the Lord was with him, even when he ignored him, and that's true for you. The second stage of doubt that happens in this story and that gets us closer to Gideon becoming a mighty warrior comes in the form of excuses. Look at verse 13 with me. "Pardon me, my Lord," Gideon replied, "but if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, 'Did not the Lord bring us out of Egypt?' But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian." The Lord turned to him and said, "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?" "Pardon me, my Lord," Gideon replied, "but how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." Did you notice here that Gideon has a whole lot of different kinds of excuses? I'm the weakest. I'm the least. Who is Gideon putting his trust in when it comes to a battle? Himself. For him, it's all about numbers. It's all about power. God's going to prune this away later from Gideon's life and faith. But Gideon's trusting in himself. He's not trusting in God. And did you notice that Gideon does so? He kind of argues with God here, but at least he does so politely. Then on two separate occasions, he's like, "Pardon me, my Lord." It's almost like he's asking, those commercials for Grey Poupon? He's almost like, "Pardon me, my Lord, do you have any Grey Poupon?" He's very kind and gracious as he approaches God. But at the same time, he's incredibly doubtful. And I love the way that the Lord responds to Gideon in these moments. It's in verse 18. "And the Lord said, I will wait until you return." This might be the patience of God, the most striking characteristic of his character and identity in today's day and age, because for you and me, the more that we can do, the less patient we become. And we live in the most striking of impatient ages, do we not? This is kind of the posture of the 21st century. The only thing that would make this better is if Donald Duck actually had a smartphone in his hand. Then it would be complete. NPR puts it this way. We speed date, eat fast food, use self-checkout lines in grocery stores. We try the one weekend diet. We pay extra for overnight shipping, honk when the light turns green, thrive or dive on quarterly earning reports, speak in half sentences, start things but don't. We tweet stories in 140 characters or less, and yet some tweets are too long. We cut corners, take shortcuts, send new faces to Washington every 2 years, and then vote the rascals out 2 years later. Can people say amen? That is the nature in which we live today, and what you need to hear is what God said to Gideon in the midst of your excuses, in the midst of your impatience, that the Lord waits for you even when you give him excuses. Isaiah said he wasn't good enough. Moses said he wasn't articulate enough. Over and over in the Bible, excuse after excuse, and yet God breaks through all of those excuses. Can you think of something right now that you know that God in his word in your life wants you to do right now? And instead of acting upon it, you've got a rationalization for not doing it. It's a form of doubt, a functional atheism where your trust is still in yourself and your own abilities instead of his way for you. The third way that Gideon becomes a mighty warrior from a coward is he goes through a period of hiding. Look at verse 25. And up to this point, God has given Gideon a dramatic sign to make it perfectly clear. It involves fire. It's really cool. But here's verse 25. That same night, the Lord said to him, take the second bull from your father's herd, the one 7 years old, tear down your father's altar to Baal and cut down the Asherah pole beside it. Then build a proper kind of altar to the Lord your God on top of this height. Using the wood of the Asherah pole that you cut down, offer the second bull as a burnt offering. And so Gideon took 10 of his servants and did as the Lord told him. But because he was afraid of his family and the townspeople, he did it when? At night, rather than in the daytime. The sacrifice that Gideon is asked to give here is that of a bull. I don't want you to miss the irony of this. The mascot for Baal, the god of that area, the fertility cult of that time, the most prominent figure that dominated that region, religiously speaking, guess what the mascot of Baal was? A bull. And so Gideon's to walk up to this altar, to tear it apart, and to sacrifice a bull on top of it unto the Lord. Do you think this was going to be a very popular activity with the natives and the locals? And so Gideon's like, man, the Lord is speaking to me. I got to do what he's telling me to do, but the Lord didn't tell me I couldn't do it at nighttime. And so he sneaks off, kind of like Nicodemus in the New Testament. He sneaks off, does what's called to do, and then just kind of wakes up in the morning when the whole thing's over and is like, I don't know what happened either. He's probably standing there at the altar scratching his head going, how did this happen? He does it at nighttime because he wants to hide. This time he's hiding from his own family. He's not hiding from the Midianites anymore. He's hiding from his own clan, his own town, his own people. And so he's come to put a little more of his trust and his confidence in God, but that line of trusting in God stops when it makes it controversial or unpopular for him, when he feels threatened by it. And so I love the response that God gives to Gideon in this moment. Then the Spirit of the Lord This is verse 34. The Spirit of the Lord came on Gideon. The Hebrew word there for the Spirit of God coming to Gideon is that it clothed him. Think all the way back to Genesis, Adam and Eve in the garden when God made clothes for them. This is an incredible act of grace in the midst of fear and in the midst of shame. God meets him in this place. And so here's the third thing I want you to make sure you see when it comes to overcoming doubt, and that is that the Lord covers you even when you're afraid. The Lord covers you even when you're afraid. And then the last phase of overcoming doubt is this. It's the testing. And this is the most famous part of the story, and yet it's the most misunderstood. Gideon said to God, "If you will save Israel by my hand as you have promised, look, I will place a wool fleece on the threshing floor. If there is dew only on the fleece and all the ground is dry, then I will know that you will save Israel by my hand as you have said." And that is what happened. Gideon rose early the next day. He squeezed the fleece and wrung out the dew, a bowl full of water. And then Gideon said to the Lord, "Do not be angry with me. Let me make just one more request. Allow me one more test with the fleece, but this time make the fleece dry and let the ground be covered with dew." And that night God did so. Only the fleece was dry and all the ground was covered with dew. This is what Gideon is famous for. The fleecing moment. And yet Gideon knows as much as anybody what the Old Testament said. It's a quote that Jesus says later to reiterate when he's in the wilderness. Do not put the Lord your God to the test. Gideon is testing God. He has received a direct revelation from God. He has seen miraculous signs of God. He has been saved by God. He has been called by God, and none of it is enough for him. He doesn't actually want faith. He wants certainty. And so he does a little test, and God meets that test, and then he's not even sure enough about that, so he constructs the exact opposite test, and God meets that test. In other words, God not only works through us, he works in spite of us. In other words, the Lord works through you even when you disobey him. And this is the core of the gospel, my friends. That Gideon does not become a mighty warrior because of his own heroic abilities. He becomes a warrior because the Lord is with him even when he ignored him. And the Lord waits for him even when he gave excuses to him. And that the Lord covered him even when he was afraid. And that the Lord worked through him even when he was in the midst of his disobedience. So many people read this story and they're like, yeah, I'm supposed to be like Gideon. I have these little Ouija board moments with God. That's not how it works. I mean, sure, God met Gideon in this moment, but you need to know that Gideon was being disobedient when God met him in this moment. It's not an example of faithfulness, it's an example of failure. And yet God meets him in his failure. While we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Gideon goes from being a coward to a mighty warrior, but he has to go through the crucible of functional atheism and kind of believers doubting, if you will, of ignoring God, making excuses to God, hiding from God, and testing God. And it is only after he goes through this journey that he discovers his true calling. When I was 14 years old, I was a part of a family that is incredibly artistic. You see my drawing up on the screen. You can tell that I'm not incredibly artistic. I mean, my sister, took calligraphy. My dad does oil painting and watercolor. My mom does like every possible craft, pottery in the book. And we grew up going to this family camp that was all centered around art projects. And by the time I was 14 years old, my grandfather knew, he's like, we're losing Rich. He's going to get in trouble because he does not want to do any of this stuff. And so he said, you know what? He said to my parents, let's still go to camp. And my grandfather used to teach. He was really crafty as well. He used to teach the stained glass class. And he said, I'm not going to teach that class. I'm going to do one-on-one instruction with Rich. I did not have a better option, or I might have objected to this. I was 14 years old. My granddad said, you're going to spend like 6 hours a day with me. I had no idea what we were going to do. I didn't know if we were going to go chop wood, kind of in the forest. I had no idea what he had in mind for me. Pulled me into the hotel room, and he had one of those 1980s sized video cameras. Just ginormous. And he had a handful of cards on which he had written a couple of topics. And he handed me the stack of cards, and he said, choose one. Picked a card. He said, look at it. I looked at the card. He said, you have 5 minutes to prepare a speech that will not be any longer than 5 minutes on that topic. Begin now. And then he videotaped me giving that speech, and he made me watch it. And then he had me critique it, and he said, do it again. And I did it again. And then he critiqued it. And then he said, do it again. And I had to do it again, and then I had to watch it 4 times, a 5-minute speech that you had 5 minutes to work on until you made it better. And then he said, pick another card, any card. And I did it again and again and again. My grandfather, when I was 14 years old, put me through public speaking boot camp that he had learned through the Toastmasters. And I'll never forget when he was there, on the day that I was ordained as a pastor to preach on the steps of his church, a smile on his face. And what I remember, I wasn't planning on getting emotional when I wrote this out, was that he saw something in me far before I saw it in myself. And I had a lot of doubts. I was kind of an awkward teenager. That may be an oxymoron. Maybe that's just kind of the way that teenage is. But I didn't really have a path or something that I was particularly passionate about. It was almost like my grandfather came to me at 14 years old and he said, hey, you're going to be a preacher. And I should have run the other way at that time. But he had a vision. He saw me through the lens of faith. And he helped me in different stages of my life to overcome the doubts of my call. How does God see you right now? You might be thinking you're the equivalent of a coward. I'm only this. I'm only a teacher. I'm only whatever. Only a volunteer. I hate it when people say that. God sees you as some sort of a mighty warrior. And the Holy Spirit wants to cover you, to come upon your life, to make you into someone that you never thought that you could be. And it'll look really different for you than it does for me. And thanks be to God for that. But he wants you to overcome your functional atheism. He wants you to get through the ignoring, excusing, hiding, and testing. And he wants you to live for the call, for him. And so, Father, I pray for anyone here who has not heard and received that message for themselves. And like Gideon, they're tucked away just doing a task somewhere out of fear. And will you approach each and every person here who needs to hear from you right now to say, "Hail, mighty warrior, the Lord is with you." Break through our excuses. Take away our fears. Help us to stop hiding from you and from one another. And Lord, help us to see with the eyes of faith that even if we don't have certainty, we have something greater. We have you.